So thanks again for coming. Today I'm going to start presenting what I would like to think is a new framework for looking at pretty much where we are now, but we're going to start with where we came from. I think there's a lot of clues in our history and our origin from many different perspectives. I am going to be drawing on several traditions, including the modern scientific tradition. Doesn't necessarily mean it has all the answers, but I think there's a lot of good information there. I'm also going to be suggesting that a lot of the traditions that have come down to us are in fact telling us the same story, even though that's not usually what we've been told. And it's going to really be an effort to look at key aspects of our origins and how that's impacted on our development and how our neural system in particular, how our brain develops, and how in turn that's affected our perception and our behavior and everything else. It sounds very grandiose, but let's see how it goes. So, very simplistically, where are we now and how did we get here? And pretty sort of simplistic pun in the title. Obviously, I think there's a lot of problems. Many people here would agree with that. Our behavior, our decisions, our political systems, the society structures. And it's also some it's also to some degree a play on the classic left-right brain sort of material that a lot of you have probably heard of. I'm going to be drawing on that quite a bit, but I'm going to turn it back to front and suggest that a lot of the information, well, a lot of the data is very good, but the conclusions that have been reached and most of us have read in books are all back to front. I'm also going to be focusing quite a lot on our forest origins and some very unique elements of our forest ecology, and particularly, and probably of most interest, our relationship with fruit. And I'll probably say this quite a few times. I'm going to try and reframe our relationship with fruit. Mostly it's considered another kind of food to eat, but fruit actually, from a botanical perspective, is the plant's sex organ, kind of the equivalent of the mammalian uterus. And its whole objective is to read DNA, to build something completely and radically different, a whole new generation, a whole sort of new generation of plants. That's where we get the seeds. That's why we have seeds in fruit. And our relationship with fruit, my proposal is, changed everything about our development and ultimately how our brain developed and ultimately its function. So I'm going to start with a bit of a summary. Can you read that at all, or is that bright enough?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to challenge you to see if this summary and other summaries I'll put up fit what you see around you. Not necessarily the conclusions you've already been given by the scientists or by other traditions. Whether this works, does it make any sense? And I'm also going to say, probably several times, that based on the modern neurological data, pretty much everybody is dominated by degrees with their left hemisphere. More or less for sure, but pretty much that's the standard picture with humans. So I'm going to throw this in now, that everything we do, all the experiments we've done, or the scientific tradition, the academic tradition, everything they've done has been generated by the left hemisphere. All the data that's come out, even when it's studying the left hemisphere, has come out of ideas by the left hemisphere, and the conclusions. And I'm going to suggest that's a very dangerous situation, because effectively the left hemisphere has been assessing itself and deciding what's going on. And that might not be the whole picture. So I'm going to start with origins. The kind of standard idea, not necessarily everybody buys it, but the standard idea is we kind of lived in the forests, no arguments there. We had these kind of relationships with the flowering plants, eating fruit. Again, that's fairly well accepted in the orthodox tradition. But we were pretty stupid. We didn't get up to anything exciting. We didn't do any high technology stuff. And eventually we came out of the forest and got really smart. Invented fire, the wheel, and built these wonderful civilizations. kind of where we're at now. It's all shiny and everything's fantastic, and we're moving forward at a wonderful pace. That's the kind of story we've been sold for the last 50 years anyway. I'm not saying anybody here buys into that, but that's still pretty much the standard paradigm. There's a few cracks appearing here and there, but within that sort of standard picture, there's a few serious anomalies. We killed at least 100 million of our own kind in the last century. And most of our economies, US economy, UK economy, most Western economies, are based on defense contracts. Most of our best technology is designed to kill us. So, it's just a weird juxtaposition that things are very advanced and we have these screamingly obvious anomalies that most of us have grown up with. And for sure it's shocking, but probably should be a lot more shocking. Most of our taxes go to fund this kind of stuff. And of course, Western culture, for the most part, is built on massive exploitation. For all the garbage we buy and we probably don't need, somewhere there are people, kids down mines, living in horrible conditions, and that's been going on forever. And even within some of the most advanced cities and culture, allegedly, this is increasingly common. It's always been there. Desperate people, totally disillusioned. So the reality, as I see it, and many other people see it when I speak to people, rather than things being phenomenally wonderful, a great deal of confusion, a lot of stress, a lot of fear. So something doesn't add up somewhere. And I'm going to try and slowly bring it back to where it doesn't add up. And it may take this talk and the talk on Friday for it all to fall into place. Now there are other perspectives and other traditions other than sort of Western science. And they have very interesting perspectives. Some of the things overlap wonderfully well. We talk about forest origins. We talk about fruit. We even talk about human genesis and something to do with the forest, something to do with fruit. Interesting. Doesn't prove anything, but very interesting. But most of the traditions speak of something starting to go seriously amiss a long time ago. Even quite explicit in some traditions, they talk about a very different sense of self, a kind of unified sense of self, radically different to what we consider normal now. And then at some point, a second self emerged, and it slowly became stronger and slowly began to dominate, to the point where the original self had all but vanished. That's integral to many traditions. The language is a little bit different, but the basic picture is the same. And I'm going to say again, I think they were starting to describe the onset of a neurological condition. That's putting it in modern language. Something was going wrong with the perceptual equipment, and they began to develop techniques and practices, treatments really, to try and slow this condition down, to try and access the more function that used to remain. And when you start laying all those practices out, strip away the beliefs and the dogma, they start to tell you something about the nature of the condition. Because really we shouldn't need treatments, we shouldn't need to meditate, we shouldn't need to do yoga. Why doesn't it work? Why do we have to put all these practices in place to get some function? So these are all kind of clues. I'm just going to run these clues by you and suggest they'll build up into a picture, and eventually, hopefully, it'll make some sense. And yet, back to the ancient traditions, what they talk about isn't something a little bit better. We weren't a little bit better at maths, or we weren't a little bit nicer to each other. It was something quite literally wholly different. And today, people still get glimpses of something akin to that. And people are usually dumbstruck. They can't find the words to express how amazing it is. So I'm not talking a little bit of difference here, I'm talking about a huge difference. And it usually seems to incorporate some kind of complete shift. People talk about being as if there was something or someone else. And it's interesting, there's such a powerful correlation in the modern neurological data. Like I say, not necessarily the conclusions, but the data is very interesting. And it's basically saying we have two selves. That's pretty much embedded in the split brain data, the two hemisphere data in the modern tradition. Currently the idea is our conceptual, our rational side, the left brain that runs pretty much everything, or at least dominates everything, is the most advanced. We've developed all these wonderful specialized abilities, like speech, like logical thinking, rational thinking, concepts, and so on. Of course, they're not reality, they're just ideas we have about what reality might be. In the same literature, the right hemisphere is acknowledged to be the hemisphere that perceives reality directly, and interestingly has traits that make the left hemisphere's abilities look pathetic by comparison. Yet somehow we're still sold the idea the left hemisphere is specialized and advanced. And as I say, it lives on concepts. So we have 100, maybe 1,000 different concepts of who and what we are. Human beings, beings of light, anything you like. Many different concepts. The right hemisphere, whenever anybody accesses the right hemisphere, it's pretty much always the same. Very difficult to describe, but always the same. And it's always pretty cool. Feels amazing, feels divine. But we've all pretty much grown up in a world dominated by concepts, words, labels. Very difficult to get away from them. If you try and strip them away, what are you left with? And most people don't feel an awful lot. We don't really feel what we are. We don't really recognize. We rely on these ideas. I'm not saying that's the case for everybody, but that's a world we currently inhabit. And I'm going to suggest that's a symptom of severe dysfunction. But paradoxically, we think it's very advanced. So I've been working on this idea for about 20 years. And I was puzzled by some of the data, and I was doing some experiments. And I was kind of wondering why the right hemisphere doesn't work as well as it should. But then one day it struck me that actually maybe there's something wrong with the left hemisphere. And as soon as I started looking at the data again, lots of things started to make sense. Even though I was looking at the data with my left hemisphere, I could understand something didn't add up here, and it was really about me and about my state of mind. And I'd invite anybody to look at the data and just be open-minded, ask a different question. Don't buy into the conclusions, but look at the data. And it's phenomenal. It tells exactly the same story as the ancient traditions. All you see are the conclusions are radically different. And particularly as the ancient traditions talk about delusion, many traditions talk about humanity sliding into delusion. Some of the specialized traits of the left hemisphere in the modern neurological literature talk about the left hemisphere being deluded. Somehow it's a good idea. There's even papers written trying to explain why delusion is a good idea. Now that's pretty amazing. Or there's something seriously wrong. I'm also going to draw on experiences and ideas that generally are looked at in isolation. It suggests they're all clues from the same condition. So human sleep. I was particularly interested in human sleep because it was something I could experiment with, and it's in a lot of the ancient practices. They often talk about accessing the sort of the perception of our ancestors if you stay awake long enough. Sounds crazy. And then you've got sleepwalking, you've got lucid dreams, vision quest. A lot of things about sleep don't make any sense in humans. But if you can imagine that each side of our brain has a different sleep requirement, the side we normally run on, because it's not in such good shape anymore, needs a lot more sleep. And if it doesn't get sleep, it feels terrible, irritable, clumsy. The last thing you want to do is stay up. Yet these traditions suggest if you push past that, you begin to access something wholly different. So if you can imagine the left hemisphere has weak batteries, you stay awake, runs the batteries down, and aside from all these dysfunctions becoming more obvious, its ability to stay in control begins to weaken. And that's when you start getting glimpses of something else. Most people, when they get tired, they get more emotional. And the emotions are to do with the right hemisphere. It's the first hints of something starting to leak through. That's as far as most people get. Tired, emotional, go to bed, recharge your batteries, wake up, everything's fine. So it's something I did a lot of experimentation with in the mid-90s. Anything up to about 7 days. I've been eating a raw food diet as well for a few years, so I thought this is an interesting combination. It's not common anymore, maybe it was at one time. I even persuaded a university to do some studies because I noticed, aside from interesting changes in my perception, I actually felt like I had more stamina and more strength. I wasn't doing any training, and I thought, well, that's something that can be tested. So Manchester University ran some tests for about 5 days. That's as long as they'd let me stay awake because they were frightened I'd go mad or die or something. And they particularly tested things that they knew suffered during sleep deprivation. The guy who supervised the experiment was ex-military, and he'd been through all sorts of preparation for sleep deprivation in the field. He was particularly interested in coordination and balance, but some of the other things I mentioned before, strength, stamina. So I went with the proposal saying, look, if I can stay steady state, if I can stay as functional as I am normally, that would be interesting, because all the orthodox data suggests you're going to go downhill. You're going to lose a lot of function very quickly. What I actually got, or what they got, was improving function. It's the only study I know that's ever been done on a human neural system that's been built from the materials we know it should have been built from in the past and put through these kind of tests. Never been done before. And they promised to publish before they did the experiment, but once these results started coming in, they said, we don't understand this, we'll have to do it again. I said, great. They said, we haven't got any money, so it's never been done since, unfortunately. Some more clues. Hypnosis. I don't know if any of you have been involved in hypnosis or NLP, that kind of thing. Again, ancient tradition, modern equivalent. A technique to get access to more function and usually better memory. Why do we need techniques? Why can't we just access this stuff? Why is it buried away? Why do some people have some access, some people don't? And the data where it exists suggests it's very much to do with left and right hemisphere. So I'm bringing these things up and I'm suggesting they're all related to the same condition, and you can check out the data. Each of these areas has masses and masses of data. Pretty obvious one-handedness. Humans in particular, very strongly handed. Not talking about preference. A lot of animals have preference. They might choose to use one side of their arms or their legs or whatever. Humans are usually locked in. It's like obligate handedness. We don't really have a choice. And it struck me early on as fascinating. I'm strongly right-handed. And I've always wondered why I have this bloody useless left hand that will not do as it's told, and it's really clumsy, and what's the point of that? But I also noticed during these experiments with sleep deprivation that actually my left hand began to become as dexterous as my right, often much better, and that showed up in the tests. My left hand became a lot more functional than my right hand. All the orthodox literature says it's genetically fixed, it does not change. You stay awake, it changes. And other people have noticed this in experiments. Handedness can change with state of mind. So, a few clues. I'm going to have a look now at the kind of orthodox views of evolution. Not everybody's favourite, but I think some interesting data there. And again, I think it correlates very well with the ancient traditions. I think they're telling the same story. So we've seen this slide before. The standard idea is hanging out in the forest, not really up to much, pretty stupid. And then finally came out of the forest and did all this cool stuff. And within that, still a lot of mysteries. Evolutionary theory's been fairly good at predicting how species develop, how they evolve, but a big mystery with human evolution. How on earth we had this massive neocortex, why it evolved, where did it evolve? And a lot of orthodox thinking is something to do with hostile environments, because that kind of works for lots of species, at least as far as the theory goes. If you end up in a hostile environment, it forces you to adapt, and those traits are passed on. So there's a lot of obsession with us moving out into savanna-like situations, hostile situations, and that's where we got our big brain, and that's where we became clever. Even though most of the really advanced neural systems actually live in the forest. So there's already an explanation. Unusual neural systems live in the most complex molecular ecology we know, the tropical rainforests, with very few exceptions. And yet there's been this obsession that somehow in the most chemically impoverished environments, we built the most complex thing we know. So really big contradiction there. We see in a little bit, there's really nothing on the savannah to build a big brain like this and to fuel it with all the complex neurochemistry it needs. So I'm going to move into some kind of analogies just to explain basic design, basic construction, basic specifications, and point out some of the huge contradictions again in modern science. You go to any engineer, or in fact any basic approach to science, and there's these very rigid protocols, and it applies to everything except apparently the most complex thing we know, the thing between our ears and the thing doing the science. Allegedly it doesn't matter what you build it from, it doesn't matter what you fuel it from, won't make any difference. But what I've been suggesting is the only reason we think that is in fact because we've gone through a window where the design parameters have gone to hell, the construction materials have gone to hell, and our brain doesn't work properly anymore. So I wanted to look at basic original design, basic materials, basic fuel. And if it applied to anything that we would normally want to go out and buy, typical Western icon, a Ferrari, if you were to suggest that you could change the design, take the blueprint, change the design by maybe 1%. Very complex piece of kit by technological standards. Change your design by 1%, you probably wouldn't be able to build it. It wouldn't fit together. It certainly wouldn't work. Building materials, construction materials, specifications, you might be able to change those by 5-10%, build it, and it might work. You wouldn't want to drive it very fast. You certainly wouldn't want to buy it. Same with the fuel. Very high specification fuel, designed for a certain kind of fuel. Would you change it? Would you put sort of cooking fat in it, or would you put some water in it? No, of course not. Really basic stuff, never applied to the human neural system. The whole of modern neurology pays no attention to original design, original construction, original fuel. Never been questioned. And when I say design, we'll get onto that a bit more, I'm not talking about intelligent design in the way some people talk about. I'm talking about how the DNA is read, how the DNA is read to build the neural structure. How you read the DNA correlates very precisely with the structure of the neocortex, the brain generally, and that in turn correlates with function. I'm not saying they're the same thing. I'm not saying we are our brain. I'm saying our brain somehow facilitates our sense of self, like a musical instrument. The instrument is like the brain, the music is our sense of self. Change your design, change the structure, and it changes the sound. So following on from that, looking at our original design, the factors that I think have been overlooked, yet they're in the literature. Well, we could go a long way back, but I'm just going to stick with basic biology because I think that's enough to begin with. How on earth we ended up with this thing that we know has got phenomenal capacity and yet generally is behaving like it's some kind of idiot as a species. Well, as far as science can tell, DNA has something to do with it. It's like the library, it's like the blueprint. And a lot of focus on if you change the DNA, you get different structure. Seems a very good theory. What's becoming increasingly of interest, becoming more interesting to the sort of scientific community is how the DNA is read. Generally termed epigenetics, or the transcription environment. What is it that reads the DNA? And that makes a massive difference. So if you go along to the primatologists and the anthropologists, they pretty much agree forest origins. We evolved in the most complex molecular ecology we know, tropical forests. Not only that, there's quite a bit of literature on our symbiotic relationship with plants, particularly our ingestion of fruit. Eating the fruit to disseminate the seeds, symbiotic relationship. So that's in the literature, it's nothing new. But what seems to be missing from that, although it's present if you go along to pharmacology and along the corridor to some of the other departments, all the information's there, they just don't speak to they don't speak to each other. Fruit, as I said before, isn't just another food. That's how it's seen, that's how it's sort of perceived. Oh, well, it's something we ate because it was, easy to find. And fruit is a highly specialized organ. It evolved and it's designed to read DNA radically differently. It's trying to build a whole new generation. And animal DNA and plant DNA, the same molecule. In fact, the separation between all these things are arbitrary. These are labels we've given them. Remember labels? Animals and plants, they're very different. Well, they're not. There's 10 or 12 major differences and thousands of similarities. Basically the same organism, slightly repackaged. So what happens if you take mammalian DNA and you effectively put it in the uterus of a bunch of plants? Is it going to be the same? Is it going to build the same structure? Absolutely not. Yet we know that was original design. And fruit's also loaded with all sorts of cool chemicals. They have massive antioxidant properties. Really handy if you're trying to build a big brain, because the brain's made of volatile fatty acids and it'll oxidize as soon as you look at it. But if you're flooding it with antioxidants 24/7, you can build a really big brain. Fruit's also full of neuroactive chemicals. We eat a lot of fruit, and yet there's a lot of propaganda about drugs. Fruit's full of drugs. They're not really strong, but they affect neural function. They give you a powerful lift, they make you feel good, and they enhance all sorts of functionality. And then particularly, my interest is in a class of compounds called flavonoids. There are others, but flavonoids in particular. Loads of research in the last 10 to 20 years. And flavonoids, these are the chemicals that change the way the DNA is read. Not only do they change the way the DNA is read, they change the way our own mammalian hormones act. So the hormones that you'll have heard of, like estrogens and testosterone, the chemicals in fruit have a massive impact on how those hormones work. They generally inhibit them, they dampen them down and change the way they work. So our origins, according to the modern scientific tradition, is we were in this close relationship for tens of millions of years, and that changes the way everything evolves. It changes the way our brain evolved. If it evolved in that environment, it can't possibly work outside that environment. It's not going to be designed properly. It's not going to work properly. It's a bit like taking your car, taking the oil out, taking the petrol out, putting in some really poor parts made from chocolate or plastic and saying it's the same thing. It's not going to work. And the scale of the change is massive, particularly with a festival like this where we're looking at things like raw food, fruit, cooked food and so on. It's not just changing it a little bit, it's changing it out of all recognition. Remember, this is the most complex thing we know. Tiny changes in structure, tiny changes, molecular changes, minute damage, congenital changes, massive impact on development and on a perception. And the place it was designed and built, gone. We don't do that anymore. So I'm really highlighting what's a really good candidate for massive change, and whether that correlates with the ancient traditions talking about something going terribly wrong, and often and interestingly linked to some kind of ecological catastrophe. And the smoking gun in the modern literature suggests a really big drying, very big climatic drying about 250,000 years ago. And if we were dependent on the tropical forests and on-seasonal tropical forests, if they'd been stable for a long time, which they can be, and in fact our very perceptual equipment was dependent on it, if those forests ever go, we're in deep trouble. And there's this spike in the pollen record, big change in the flora, say roughly 250,000 years ago. Text stopped expanding. probably read some of this. Our neocortex, our brain was expanding at an increasingly rapid rate, very rare in biology, this very expensive piece of equipment to build. Clearly most animals don't need anything like this to survive. Survival is not really the issue. So it's expanding massively quickly, triples in about 2 million years, triples in size, and then suddenly it stops expanding. Now that's interesting to me. Why does it stop expanding? And actually it's been shrinking a little bit ever since. We've lost 10 to 20% of volume. Size in everything, but there is a correlation at some level. So again, just saying all these clues, you start laying them out and as a picture starts to emerge. Catastrophic failure in a design because the forest disappeared. Tropical forest, very stable. If they go, they take a long, long time to come back. And not only are you waiting for the forest to come back, you're waiting for 10, 20, 50, 200 species of trees to mature and produce the chemistry needed to design one of these things. So in the meantime, what do? Well, fortunately, forest provided us with a phenomenal piece of kit and very intelligent. We survived. But what did we have to do to survive? We had to ingest, eat, build ourselves from all sorts of crazy stuff. Kept us alive, but there's no way it could compare with the complexity needed to keep this design process alive. Really basic stuff. And again, it's not new stuff, it's in the literature. So many people obsessed with trying to figure out where our brain evolved in these chemically impoverished environments. Nobody wants to look at the forest, at least not in modern academia, even though it's the most complex ecosystem we know. And I'm particularly interested in the non-seasonal tropical forest. That's the only place you get fruit 24/7 for millions of years. Seasonal tropical forest, not as conducive, not the best place. Non-seasonal, very narrow strip, you get fruit all the year round. And it's amazing, it fits our physiology in so many other ways. Very inefficient with water. Doesn't matter if you live in a wet environment. Frugivorous physiology, that's generally acknowledged despite the propaganda that goes with all sorts of vested interests in what we should be eating. So again, just a summary. Where would something like this have emerged from? Incredibly complex or incredibly impoverished? Doesn't mean we won't find evidence of humans living in all sorts of environments, but does that tell us where all this cool stuff was going on? And what modern academia has done is any evidence of humans or our ancestors being found in these hostile environments is presumed to represent the whole lineage. We find one fossil in an arid environment. That means we all took off out of the forest where the fruit drops off the tree and feeds us. Symbiotic relationship, remember. We wandered out into these incredibly hostile environments and had a hell of a time surviving. Why on earth would we do that? Crazy stuff. Unless it was imposed in some way. And when we talk about symbiosis, it really gets quite cool. It's not really about humans, our ancestors in the forest. Symbiosis is really about a formulation of a whole new organism. There was no human and no forest anymore. Something emerged as a kind of well, I guess a whole new organism, really. A forest-human complex is probably the best way to put it. So we kind of coolly go around thinking we're really intelligent. It's actually the forest that built this thing. It's the forest that became self-aware. It's the forest that built this massive perception equipment. But when the forest disappeared, we were left high and dry. We survived. Without all that cool biochemistry, we began to revert to type. Our DNA could only ever build a primitive neural system. They're really good at surviving. They'll reproduce, they'll fight, they'll eat. They don't have much cognitive function. They don't have that much empathy. They don't have that much compassion. And I'm suggesting our neural system's been slowly reverting to type for the last 200,000 years. One side a bit more quickly than the other. fear and aggression, typical traits of a primitive system. This is just a brief outline. I won't dwell on this too long, unless anybody's particularly interested. Just highlighting where these changes have come in. And the kind of standard idea, which again, I think is a pretty good theory. You have your DNA code, the blueprint. It's responsible for building the brain. The brain in turn runs the hormone or the endocrine system. And that in turn provides the environment for the next generation. And round it goes. Most of the variation probably comes from here. It's a fairly good theory, I think. Changes in the code, change in structure. If it's beneficial, it'll be inherited and so on. And what you eat doesn't have a massive impact. Some impact. It'll make some impact, but not a lot. Unless it happens to be this. And remember, this is the equivalent of this. This is the plant's sex organ, the plant's uterus in effect, loaded with hormones, absolutely designed to read DNA differently. You start putting this in the loop and you change everything else. It doesn't change the DNA code, it just changes the way it's read. In the same way that as an adult male, if I take enough estrogen, I'll start developing breasts. My DNA hasn't changed, but the way it's read changes, and it'll change the structure of my body. That's how powerful hormones are, incredibly powerful. And we formed a relationship with hormonally loaded sex organs of a wholly other kingdom. Incredibly rare, can only happen in the non-seasonal tropics. A lot of animals will eat fruit, but it's seasonal. It's got to be perpetual, it's got to be there all the time. And our physiology fits that profile very well. So you form a relationship with this for long enough and it's going to have a massive impact. All sorts of things are going to change, in particular things like developmental windows. Remember I said the chemicals in fruit inhibit things like testosterone and estrogen. Now in fairly basic mammalian development, things cycle very quickly. Reproducing quickly is a good thing. You add this to the mixture and you start slowing the developmental windows down. It takes longer to develop, which actually is a very good thing if you're building a big brain. You need a long time to build a big brain. No way to build a big brain with a short developmental window. And there's a lot of mystery about that. It's kind of this juvenile features that humans have. Where did that come from? What was going on with that? And nobody's been able to figure that out. Well, it wasn't coming from our own DNA, it was coming from the fruit. And in recent times, even in the last 100 years, developmental windows have been shrinking 10, 20%. The age of puberty is dropping. And that's the very window we need to build this big thing, and our immune system and everything else. So even in the last 100 years, an observable change in the window we need to build the most complex thing we know. It's quite frightening stuff. So the forest goes, massive drying window, forest disappears, and we got to survive, and we do what we need to survive. But of course these inputs, it's not so much what we put in, it's what we've lost. So remember, that's what we're losing. Tropical trees, we know, most complex biochemical factories there are. An individual tree will produce more pharmacological compounds than the whole of the pharmacology industry. One tree. Primates typically form relationships with many species, maybe 200, certainly 50, maybe 100. So the combined biochemistry, many species, concentrated in the developmental environment. And it's a symbiotic relationship. The plants start competing with each other. They want seed disseminators. So what are they going to do? They're not going to hand out gifts that we don't want. They're going to make them loaded with things that make us feel good. Powerful neurochemistry, really good nutrition. Full of colors. In fact, the colors, most of the colors are flavonoids. Flavonoids give fruit their color. Remember, these are sex organs, so the plants, they're swelling up their sex organs and making them look attractive. It's pretty sexy stuff, really. It's a whole new slant on oral sex. And then we end up, as I say, replacing it with this kind of stuff. Probably had no choice. Massive impact on our development. And the cool bit in all of this, or the frightening bit, depends on which way you look at it, each side of a brain was always, and the literature's fairly recent on this, was always, there was a slight difference in the genetics. One side was always genetically a bit different from the other. Probably for good reasons. One side of the brain had a bit more specialization than the other. You add this stuff to the equation, and it starts ironing out those differences. And you end up with a neocortex that's structurally the same. Phenomenally different capacities and traits, structurally the same, working as a singular system. Take this out of the equation, and all that begins to change. But remember that the deeply encoded blueprint is slightly different. So one side is going to be affected a bit more quickly than the other. That's all. One side slowly becoming more primitive a bit more quickly than the other. The process progresses, and remember, the neural system runs the endocrine system. At some point, as one side becomes more and more primitive, remember the traits of primitive neural systems, you get fear, need for control, less perception, so on. Eventually takes control. And you end up with the least functional neural system running the endocrine system, pumping more of our primitive steroids, testosterone, estrogen, and much less of the things that dampen them down, like the way the pineal works, producing melatonin. This starts to diminish. And we lose a lot of these protective chemistry, not only from our diet, but also the chemistry we're producing ourselves. So it's kind of accelerating its own decline. Probably somewhere in the last 10 to 20,000 years that happened, to flip from unified system in cooperation but slowly declining, and finally the least functional side takes control. Totally back to front in terms of how orthodox neurology sees it. The data's really good, but the presumption is this is a good thing. This is specialized adaptation. We've developed this left hemisphere for very good reasons, according to the left hemisphere, obviously. And then we end up in this ludicrous situation again. Back to the Ferrari, back to the basic design, construction. So we go from this kind of stuff, off the scale complexity. Don't think about fruit anymore. Think about the most complex molecular formula ever. And then we go to this kind of stuff. And it's not going to make any difference, is it? Absolute joke. You could only come up with a conclusion like that if you had severely impaired mental health. Of course, it's very circular. We're at the wrong end of this. Remember the ancient traditions. They all said we were in deep trouble. We were sliding into delusion. That was already a long time ago. Once you're deluded, it's very difficult to know that you're deluded. It's like having dementia and having somebody trying to explain that you've got dementia. Even if you say it clearly, well, unfortunately, you've got dementia. It doesn't mean anything anymore. How are we doing for time? Anybody know?
It's about 45 minutes.
What, left or gone?
Since we started.
Okay.
It's 2:35.
What have I got, till 3 or?
No.
Or keep going.
2:30.
Oh, I'm already overrun.
We don't care. Keep going.
Keep
Can't fit
going.
any more people in.
Yeah, keep going.
Okay. So, what I'm proposing is serious neural retardation. It's pretty challenging stuff with severe perceptual symptoms. There's no way I can get away with that if there's not a mountain of evidence. Behavioral, societal, mechanisms, biochemistry. They should all be there, or I'm completely wrong on this. Well, you know, from the basic evolutionary biology, and particularly in the last 10, 20 years, I mentioned flavonoids, sort of classes of flavonoids, increasingly studied in isolation, but we know they were present in our evolutionary environment in abundance, flooded with them 24/7. That's what you do when you're eating fruit. You're flooding yourself with flavonoids. Really cool chemistry. And when you look at the mechanisms and what these flavonoids do, it's astounding. There's not time to go into it all now, but they do an amazing amount of cool things. Look it up. We also know now from the study of epigenetics, people are more and more open to the idea that it's not so much about changing the code, it's changing the developmental environment. But remember, we effectively developed in the uterus of the plant. Sounds crazy, but that's effectively what we were doing. Flooding ourselves with the biochemistry of the plant's uterus. Massive, massive impact. The very ancient origins, according to modern science, insect-eating ancestor. Insects had already started forming a relationship with plants. The plants really were in charge. I mean, they were sort of hijacking insects who were hijacking animals to do their kind of sexual dirty work. And the insects, of course, in the plants, they're being tempted with nectar, so a sweet treat. Insect-eating animals follow them in, start eating the flowers, which are also rich in flavonoids. That's where the colours from flowers come from. And to push it a bit further, the plants, as I say, they start swelling their sex organs. And they're limited to what is already in the sex organ, which is this rich hormonal cocktail to produce the plant's next generation, designed to read DNA. So we start forming a relationship with that. And the plants start competing with each other. Bigger, brighter, sexy, more gaudy. And that's the kind of stuff we want. I mean, anybody been down late at night eating durian?
Yeah.
It's pretty raunchy stuff, you know? So genetic and mind-altering substances by the kilo, 24/7 for millions of years. That's our origins. Not really disputed in modern orthodox literature. And yet people still scratching their heads. What's the unique factor about human evolution? Why do we end up with this big brain? It's screaming out at us. Unfortunately, due to the separation, we're not too smart anymore. There's quite a bit I could talk about the pineal. I'm probably going to run out of time, but flavonoids, I've mentioned them. I'll mention them a lot more, probably tomorrow as well. I talked about their neurochemical effects, neuroactive effects. A lot of them are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. That means they kind of generally elevate our mood. They will also, those class of chemicals, activate the pineal. One of the few ways to get the pineal to work harder is to take monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Which is, ooh, that's bad, it's drugs. Well, actually, fruit contains monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And what is a pineal pump? Melatonin, quinoline. Exactly what you need to build and maintain a big brain. So the fruit diet is fueling the pineal, and it's in turn pumping the very chemistry we need to protect and build a big brain. Take the diet away, you lose the dietary effects. It also reduces the effectiveness of the pineal. Double whammy. Not good. Just throwing this in as a, you know, in our recent times, in this kind of period of advancement, inventing agriculture, we mostly rely now on building this complex piece of equipment from what the primatologists would call fallback foods, some roots, some tubers. Wouldn't be so bad if we ate them raw, but we tend to microwave them, bake them, beat the hell out of them. And then grass seed, masses of grass seed. Rodents eat grass seed, a few birds eat grass seed. It does not build big brains. It's full of all sorts of chemicals saying, don't eat me, I don't want to be eaten. Fruit's the opposite, it's like, come and get me. But there's the theory. We started eating all this stuff and somehow we built a big brain. Like I say, wheat, barley, rice, corn, grass seed. Forget all these nice names, it's grass seed. That's all it is. And again, it wouldn't be so bad if we sprouted this stuff, but again, beat the hell out of it, bake it, microwave it. And that's what we build our brain from today. And of course, we're seeing the physical effects of this, massive physical effects now. All sorts of degenerative diseases. Well, our body is relatively resilient. What on earth impact is this having on our neural system? Way more sensitive, way more delicate. We're building our neural system from deep fried tubers and flour. It's, you know, it's made from glue and starch. It's shocking. So really, in essence, I know I've sort of run around all over the place, but in essence, this is quite a simple idea. Let's look at the forests again. What are the forests capable of doing? What is the biochemistry of the forest? Could it possibly explain all these anomalies with our physiology, our neural system? And why has nobody been looking at this? Even though it's in these ancient traditions, like I say, they talk about forest dwelling. They talk about living naked. It must have been warm. That's the tropics. And they even talk about fruit. A couple of other clues. One thing that I certainly was told, and I'm sure many people have heard this, speech, one of the most advanced traits of the left hemisphere, one of our crowning glories. Interestingly, the left hemisphere can't sing, typically. The right hemisphere can sing, if it gets a chance, if it's allowed to sing. A lot of us, and certainly including myself, I'd feel quite intimidated to sing. I could sing this presentation. But part of me is too terrified to do that. Any ideas which part?
The left part.
Singing, way more advanced version of speech, way more information, yet apparently that's more primitive, according to the left hemisphere, of course. All these really simple contradictions, and it's in the literature. Now we got lots and lots of symptoms of split brain personality, bipolar disorders. Everywhere you look now, all sorts of characteristics that seem to slot into this twin self thing. And generally, to get access to the most phenomenal parts of our being, the prodigious, genius, savant stuff, it often takes some significant damage to our normal sense of self. There's often a very good correlation. More damage to the left. It's already in poor shape. More damage, yeah, it can be really difficult stuff. But the flip side of that is people can get phenomenal access, phenomenal memory, phenomenal abilities. Never the other way round. Never damage to the right side, phenomenal abilities on the left. Never ever. I've never come across this case study. Always left more inhibited, left more damaged, amazing abilities. What's going on there? Why is it so difficult to see this? Well, we're looking at it with the left hemisphere, and it doesn't want to see it. It's actually frightened of the idea, particularly as it thinks it's so cool and advanced.
Yeah. Is that like autism?
Yeah, autistic savants, that kind of stuff. And touching on fear, typical symptom of mental ill health, fear. Anybody here ever feel frightened? And never really want to tell anybody how frightened they feel. Humans are run by fear. It's quite a challenging idea. And yet we know there's a space somewhere, if we've been lucky enough to touch it, and certainly it's reported consistently throughout history and currently, as a space where all these wonderful traits exist, and lo and behold, the fear goes away. It's not that we become stupid and wander off cliffs. We're very aware, we know what's going on, but we're not terrified and paranoid all the time. So where's the fear coming from? If that's constantly with us, that's the dominant hemisphere. And is it any wonder the most frightened people end up taking control? And lo and behold, they're the least functional. So you end up with the emergence of patriarchy and hierarchy, not as some kind of new social paradigm, but as the symptoms of a neurological condition. I'm not suggesting our government's anything like that, but hey ho, make your own mind up. People who want to be in control generally are more frightened. I'm not talking about people who are phenomenally good at something and they end up running things because they're really good. I'm talking about people who want to be in control. It's a symptom of neurological dysfunction. Unfortunately, they mostly run everything, and they're doing a really good job. And again, this so-called higher function, whether it's a kind of spiritual higher function or kind of cognitive higher function, why is it so rare? We consider ourselves so advanced. Who here has invented anything? Who here has come up with anything cool? We take credit for some of the very few geniuses that do exist, and they're often quite quirky. They've often had all sorts of behavioral problems, but they have access to something amazing. Most of us don't. Why is it so rare? Why is it so difficult to get at? again, going back to the ancient traditions, all these techniques and practices, think of them as treatments. Why did we need them and what can they tell us? And I'd suggest, you can make your own mind up, I'd suggest they break quite nicely into 3 categories. And they're often written about explicitly or it's implied in the technique. Techniques to inhibit the left hemisphere. Calm it down. Quieten the speech thing down. Stop the chattering. That's left hemisphere. It's constantly going on. If you can find a way to calm it down, you start getting glimpses of something else. Trappist tradition. Traditions where people didn't speak for weeks, months, years on end. Anything to shut the stupid thing up. I also mentioned sleep deprivation. Quite a harsh technique. I'm not recommending it unless you're, really up for an adventure. Starves the left hemisphere of its recharge time, and it doesn't like it, and you will feel crap. But eventually, it loses control. Something else starts to kick in. So one set of approaches, inhibit the left hemisphere. Another set of approaches, stimulate the right hemisphere. Complex music. The left hemisphere cannot hear complex stuff. It cannot see complex stuff. You have to move to the right to hear and see all these complex things.
How long, how many days of sleep deprivation did you say until it winds down?
I'll do questions at the end, but very briefly, looking at the ancient traditions.
What was the question?
Is how many days of sleep deprivation can make a difference. I'm not really going to do questions now, but I'll answer that one. I'd say between 3 and 7 days is a really sweet window. And it's in the ancient traditions. The very earliest text we know, the cuneiform tablets in Persia, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is it's like an initiates account of trying to reach the lost state of consciousness of the ancestors and these various tests and challenges. The very last one, and this is the earliest text we have currently, stay awake for 7 days and nights. The Buddha reaching some kind of deeply altered state after 7 days of meditation. Well, meditation is the same as sleep deprivation. It's in Vision Quest, the Vision Quest approach, staying awake till you get into a visual way of perceiving things instead of a conceptual way. Lots of clues, but certainly not an easy approach. Things to stimulate the right hemisphere, including putting back some analogues of the neurochemistry from the forest that's now gone missing. We're talking about the shamanic tradition here, the plant medicines, currently classed as drugs, all the propaganda, these things are bad, but fruit's good. The plant chemicals, used carefully, they'll stimulate the right hemisphere because it has a totally different architecture. It has the relics of this very advanced architecture. You put some of these chemicals in, it stimulates the right hemisphere, boom, big shift, it's suddenly and temporarily out of its prison. And if it's done carefully and correctly, people have a real trouble trying to explain how amazing it was. And the third approach is generally a rebuild, an engineering rebuild. So we're talking fasting, diet, natural foods, fruit and vegetables. Well, forget all those things. Talk about incredibly advanced molecular engineering. You start putting these things together. So really good diet, techniques to inhibit the left, techniques to stimulate the right, and it starts getting a lot easier. You can start getting these glimpses a lot easier. Very simple formula. And again, I'd suggest all the techniques pretty much fit into those categories. There's a whole bunch of stuff on human fertility and kind of some of the things that are considered normal. If you add this massive flavonoid cocktail and the effect it has on our own hormones, too much detail to go into, but the suggestion is a lot of the things we consider normal to do with ovulation, menstruation, may not be normal. They may be symptoms of an endocrine system in disarray. Remember, these chemicals, they typically inhibit estrogen and testosterone. And there's evidence of the classic cycles in humans slowing when you start adding flavonoids. Of course, there's studies, small amounts of flavonoids. We were flooding ourselves with flavonoids 24/7. They're quite contraceptive in their effect. Of course, contraception ultimately is not a good thing. So again, not a lot of time to go into this. There's information in the book or on the website. but it may start to explain some of the mechanisms to do with reproduction. Why is it we have potentially these intense orgasmic states that can be accessed? An orgasm in males is about ovulation. It's the equivalent of ovulation. In females, that may have been what was required at one time to ovulate, because there was so much of this chemistry inhibiting ovulation. Ovulation was static. It was just the ovum ready to go, held in stasis until there was intense sexual activity. Very efficient system. And there's echoes of it in other species. But because we've lost all this, it's kind of reverted to a more archaic estrus cycle, and it just kind of runs of its own accord. A lot of stuff that, as I say, online, a lot of information on this, very different conclusions, but the data's very good. Melatonin's even been tested for a contraceptive. It's quite effective. Remember, the pineal gland, when you're eating fruit, is going to be pumping more melatonin. Again, back to the hormones, testosterone, quite a strong correlation with aggressiveness. Works quite well in primitive neural systems, competition. Kind of a lot of Darwin's work has been interpreted about competition. That's not really what he was on about. It was part of it. He was also very interested in symbiosis and cooperation. Take the fruit away, the pineal gland doesn't work as much, and our own ancient hormones start to dominate again, including testosterone. And males produce more testosterone than females. So this condition affects males more than females, or the symptoms are more extreme. And what do we get? Patriarchal systems where the most damaged male brains take control. I don't know if anybody spotted that, but and I can get away with that being a male. It's a very simple correlation. Hormones that we know are related to aggression, they're suddenly unleashed from millions of years of inhibition, and they design a more primitive neural system. And again, primitive neural systems typically lack much compassion, much empathy. So it's quite easy to send hundreds of thousands of people to war, and it's just a game on a board. Back to sex again, and more clues from the sort of tantric tradition and other traditions. Whole traditions dedicated to the use of sexual technique to reach higher states of consciousness. The last few thousand years have generally been inhibited. In fact, anything to do with accessing the right hemisphere in the last few thousand years has been slowly marginalized and prohibited, including dance, music, use of drugs, as we currently call them, all the propaganda around that, and sex as well. In fact, there are people I'm sure would ban sex altogether if it wasn't for the need to reproduce. Why is that? Because these are all approaches that stimulate the right hemisphere, or they can do under certain situations. And it's one of the easiest ways to start accessing those divine states. And yet most of us grown up with all these social restrictions around anything, particularly to do with pleasure. What the hell is it with pleasure? Well, the most profound pleasure comes from the right hemisphere. Is somebody due in here? Or?
No, I just needed the camera for the next three.
I think I've overrun by God knows how much.
That's okay, keep going, Fred.
Grab my camera out of the office.
Yeah, just get his camera out of the office.
I think I'm nearly done. It's almost halfway through the slides. The rest will be on Friday. A little bit on the thymus gland. Incredibly sensitive to hormones. Ancient traditions talk about us living a lot longer and being amazingly healthy, aside from all these wonderful traits we had. But remember, we were flooding ourselves with chemistry that read our DNA differently and kept our primitive steroids in check. So you take all that away, and what happens? The thymus gland is very sensitive to steroids. And instead, growing very large and being very powerful, around about puberty, it stops expanding, starts to shrink. Really simple mechanism here that might explain why our very distant ancestors were phenomenally more healthy than we are. Also ties in with estrogen-dependent cancers, epidemic of cancer. A lot of cancers are initiated or at least fueled by free estrogens. Flood yourself with estrogen inhibitors and that can't happen. And a lot of the pharmaceutical approaches are very similar to crude copies of flavonoids. They don't work as well, they have a lot of side effects. Flavonoids, in fact, do a much better job. Could also talk about the gut for probably a whole hour. In recent years, almost due to the work of one man, it turns out our gut is in fact a highly advanced neural system. It's a digestive system, but it's like a tube of neural tissue, incredibly complex neural system. Runs on exactly the same neurochemistry as our cerebral system, our brain. Of course, one of the first interfaces with this incredible cocktail from the forest is our gut. And if we lived there for a long time, there's no doubt our gut and its evolution was integral with the biochemistry of the forest. It's doubtful our gut works properly without the biochemistry of the forest. I know a lot of people notice changes in their digestion when they start eating raw food, particularly a lot of fruit. The ancients talk about chi energy developing in the gut. I certainly noticed on sleep deprivation combined with a raw diet, my gut changed shape and it felt pretty cool. It was like this being living down here somewhere.
There's someone else in here at 3 times.
What time is it now?
3.
Right, I'll just whiz through a couple more quickly then. Very quickly because I'm nearly there. I'm talking a lot about perception, but I'm also interested in functionality in a practical sense. The very best performances of our very best athletes typically come from what we call an altered state. People talk about time standing still and flying past the opposition. This isn't about muscles, this isn't about training, this is about the management system. Remember, we're talking about the cerebral management system. If you push the left hemisphere hard enough and far enough, it will break, it will give way, and something else cuts in and everything works better. So this isn't just about sitting in the corner, tripping out and feeling great. This is about having phenomenal physical capacity as well. Very powerful, very agile, way more balanced. Think of the best free rock climbers, gymnasts and so on. That's the kind of stuff we should all have. Right, that's it. Part 2 is resolving the mystery of our mind. That's on Friday. Thanks very much. I'll have to take some questions outside, I guess. So any burning questions either outside or on Friday. The framework is on the website as well. It's always building all the time. So I'm not sure.